Margaret Thompson's wrinkled hands trembled as she pinned her name tag to her crisp white uniform for the last time. 50 years of service, countless lives touched, and today was her final shift at St. Mary's Hospital. The weight of half a century pressed down on her shoulders as she gazed at her reflection in the locker room mirror. "You've done good, old girl," she whispered to herself, a bittersweet smile playing on her lips. But behind that smile lurked a secret, a burden she'd carried for far too long. As Margaret made her way down the familiar corridors, the bustle of the hospital enveloped her. Nurses rushed by with charts, doctors barked orders, and the ever-present beeping of machines created the soundtrack she'd grown accustomed to over the decades. But today, everything seemed different, more vivid, as if the universe was insisting she commit every detail to memory. "Nurse Thompson," Dr. Matt James Richardson's booming voice cut through the noise. "I hope you're not planning on sneaking out without a proper send-off." Margaret turned to face her longtime colleague and friend, forcing a chuckle. "James, you know I've never been one for fuss." The tall, silver-haired doctor's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Well, tough luck, Margaret. The entire staff is gathering in the cafeteria at noon. You can't escape this time." As James chatted animatedly about the surprise party, Margaret's mind drifted. She nodded and smiled at the appropriate moments, but her thoughts were elsewhere, specifically 50 years in the past. It had been a night like any other. The maternity ward was in chaos, understaffed and overwhelmed. 2 women had gone into labor simultaneously, their cries of pain echoing through the halls. Margaret, then a fresh-faced nurse barely out of training, had been running between rooms, trying desperately to keep up. In her haste, in one fateful moment of distraction, the memory made Margaret's stomach churn. She blinked, forcing herself back to the present, where James was still talking. "And for your last patient, we've got a special case. Daniel Cooper, admitted last night with some puzzling symptoms. I thought you might enjoy a little mystery to cap off your career." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "Cooper, you said?" James nodded, handing her a chart. "Room 507. Give it your best shot. Thompson, show these young nurses how it's done." With shaking hands, Margaret took the file. As James walked away, she leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. It couldn't be. After all these years, it couldn't be. But as she opened the chart and saw the date of birth, a cold certainty settled in her gut. Daniel Cooper. Born on that chaotic night 50 years ago, the night that had haunted her dreams ever since. Margaret closed her eyes, memories flooding back. The 2 newborns, so small, so innocent. The mix-up that occurred in a split second of confusion. By the time she'd realized her mistake, it was too late. The babies were with not their real mothers, the women who would raise them, love them, never knowing the truth. For 5 decades, Margaret had convinced herself it was better this way, that revealing the truth would only cause pain. But now, fate had brought Daniel Cooper back into her life, and with him, the weight of a secret that threatened to crush her. Taking a deep breath, Margaret steeled herself and walked towards room 507. Each step felt like a mile, the corridor stretching endlessly before her. As she reached for the door handle, a voice called out behind her. "Excuse me, are you the nurse for Mr. Cooper?" Margaret turned to see a woman hurrying towards her. Middle-aged, with kind eyes and worry etched across her face. "Yes, I'm Nurse Thompson. And you are?" "Elizabeth Cooper," the woman replied, extending her hand. "Daniel's mother. I've been so worried. They still don't know what's wrong with him." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Margaret stared at Elizabeth, her mind reeling. This woman who had raised Daniel as her own, who had no idea of the truth. "Mrs. Cooper," Margaret managed, her voice barely above a whisper. It's nice to meet you." As they entered the room together, Margaret's gaze fell upon the man in the hospital bed. Daniel Cooper. 50 years old, with graying hair and lines around his eyes. But in that moment, all Margaret could see was the newborn she'd held in her arms half a century ago. Their eyes met, and for a heart-stopping second, Margaret feared he might recognize her somehow. But Daniel merely offered a weak smile. "Ah, you must be the famous Nurse Thompson," he said, his voice hoarse. "Mom hasn't stopped talking about how lucky I am to have you on your last day." Margaret's practiced smile slipped into place, even as her heart raced. "Well, Mr. Cooper, Let's see if we can't figure out what's troubling you, shall we? As she began her examination, Margaret's mind whirled. How could she possibly handle this situation? Should she reveal the truth, or carry her secret to the grave, as she'd always planned? Little did Margaret know, her dilemma was about to become far more complicated. For in her locker, forgotten in the emotional turmoil of the morning, her phone buzzed with a message. A message from her estranged daughter, Sarah. "Mom, we need to talk. It's about Dad, and it's urgent." The stage was set. As Margaret Thompson began her last shift, the ghosts of her past converged, threatening to unravel everything she'd built over the last 50 years. And somewhere in the hospital, a ticking clock counted down to a revelation that would change lives forever. As Margaret's trembling hands checked Daniel's vitals, her mind raced, desperately trying to process the situation. Here she was, face to face with the living embodiment of her deepest secret, while Elizabeth Cooper hovered nearby, concern etched on her face. "How long have you been experiencing these symptoms, Mr. Cooper?" Margaret asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Daniel coughed weakly. "About a week now. Started with just fatigue, but then came the fever, the joint pain. It's like my body's at war with itself." Margaret nodded, jotting notes on his chart. As she worked, she couldn't help but study his features, the shape of his eyes, the curve of his jaw. How much of it came from his biological parents? How much from the loving environment Elizabeth had provided? "Nurse Thompson?" Elizabeth's voice cut through her thoughts. Is it serious?" Margaret turned to face Daniel's mother. No, the woman who had raised him, and felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly took her breath away. "We're still running tests, Mrs. Cooper, but I promise you, we're doing everything we can." As if on cue, Dr. Richardson entered the room, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a look of concern. "Margaret, can I speak with you outside for a moment?" In the hallway, James lowered his voice. "We've got a problem. Daniel's condition is deteriorating faster than we anticipated. His blood work shows some unusual markers." Margaret's heart raced. "What kind of markers?" "That's just it. We're not sure. It's like nothing I've seen before. We need a complete family medical history. Stat. Any hereditary conditions could be crucial." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Margaret. The very information that could save Daniel's life was the truth she'd spent 50 years hiding. I'll speak with Mrs. Cooper right away," Margaret managed, her mouth dry. As James hurried off to order more tests, Margaret leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. The weight of her secret pressed down on her, threatening to crush her entirely. How could she possibly, Mom? Margaret's eyes snapped open. Standing before her, looking equal parts concerned and uncomfortable, was her daughter, Sarah. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" Margaret gasped, straightening up. Sarah fidgeted with the strap of her purse. "I've been trying to reach you all morning. Didn't you get my message? It's about Dad." Before Margaret could respond, a commotion from Daniel's room caught their attention. Alarms blared as nurses rushed in, shouting orders. Elizabeth's panicked voice rose above the chaos. "Daniel! Oh God, what's happening?" In that moment, as her past and present collided spectacularly, Margaret made a decision. She turned to her daughter, grasping her hands tightly. "Sarah, I promise we'll talk. But right now, I need to do something I should have done a long time ago." With that, Margaret Thompson squared her shoulders and strode into Daniel's room, prepared to finally face the consequences of that fateful night 50 years ago. As the medical team worked to stabilize Daniel, Margaret pulled Elizabeth aside, her heart pounding so hard she was sure the other woman must hear it. "Mrs. Cooper, I need to ask you something, and it's going to sound strange, but I promise you it's important," Margaret began, her voice low and urgent. "Has Daniel ever been tested for any rare genetic conditions?" Elizabeth blinked, confusion momentarily overriding her panic. No, I don't think so. Why? What does that have to do with?" "Please," Margaret interrupted, hating herself for the pain she was about to cause. "I need you to listen carefully. What I'm about to tell you, it's going to be difficult to hear, but Daniel's life may depend on it." And so, in hushed tones as machines beeped ominously in the background, Margaret confessed. She spoke of that chaotic night half a century ago, of two babies born minutes apart, of a momentary lapse that changed lives forever. With each word, she watched the color drain from Elizabeth's face, saw the dawning horror in her eyes. "No," Elizabeth whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, you're lying. This is some kind of sick joke." "I wish it were," Margaret replied, tears streaming down her face. "But I swear to you, every word is true. And right now, we need to focus on saving Daniel. His biological family's medical history could be the key." As if in a daze, Elizabeth allowed herself to be led to a chair. Margaret quickly briefed Dr. Richardson, who looked as though he'd been struck by lightning, but quickly sprang into action, barking orders for new tests and treatments. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah approached her mother, eyes wide with confusion and a hint of anger. "Mom, what the hell is going on? What aren't you telling me?" Margaret took a deep breath, realizing that the avalanche of truth she'd started couldn't be stopped now. "Sarah, honey, there's something you need to know. About your father, and about a choice I made before you were born." As mother and daughter found a quiet corner to talk, the hospital around them continued its frantic pace. Nurses rushed back and forth, doctors consulted in hurried whispers, and in room 507, machines fought to keep Daniel Cooper alive. But beneath the surface of this medical drama, a deeper, more personal story was unfolding. A story of long-buried secrets, of lives intertwined by fate and human error, of the lengths we go to protect those we love, and the price we pay for our silence. Hours passed in a blur of tense conversations and medical procedures. As evening fell, Margaret found herself in the hospital chapel, seeking a moment of solitude in the midst of the storm she'd unleashed. The events of the day replayed in her mind, Elizabeth's shocked disbelief turning to anger, then a quiet, steely determination to do whatever it took to save her son. Sarah's initial fury at learning of her mother's deception, followed by a grudging understanding as the full weight of Margaret's burden became clear. And through it all, Daniel, sweet, innocent Daniel, fighting for his life, blissfully unaware of the seismic shifts occurring in his world. Margaret's reverie was interrupted by the chapel door creaking open. She turned to see Dr. Richardson entering, his face a mask of exhaustion. "James," she said, rising to meet him. "How is he?" The doctor sighed heavily, sinking into a pew. "Stable for now. The information about his biological family was, well, it was a game changer, Margaret. We've identified the condition and started treatment. If you hadn't spoken up when you did." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Margaret's confession, as painful as it had been, might have saved Daniel's life. "But that's not why I'm here," James continued, fixing Margaret with a serious gaze. "There's something else. Something that came up in the genetic testing." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "What is it?" James hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Margaret, the tests revealed something unexpected, a genetic marker that's incredibly rare. So rare, in fact, that I've only seen it once before in my entire career." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. "James, what are you saying?" "I'm saying," he replied slowly, "that I've seen this marker before. In your husband's medical records, Margaret, in the tests we ran before his heart surgery 5 years ago." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the implications of James's words sank in. Margaret gripped the back of the pew, her knees threatening to give way. "But that's impossible," she whispered. "Unless—" James nodded grimly. "Unless the baby you switched with Daniel that night was your own son." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Memories flooded her mind, her late husband's mysterious illness, so similar to Daniel's, the nagging feeling she'd always had that something wasn't quite right. And Sarah, oh God, Sarah. As the full horror of the situation dawned on her, Margaret realized that her 50-year-old secret was far more twisted and far-reaching than she could have ever imagined. The sobs that racked her body echoed through the empty chapel, a cry of anguish for lives forever altered by a single moment of confusion. Outside the chapel, unbeknownst to Margaret and James, Sarah stood frozen, her hand still on the door handle. She'd come seeking her mother, hoping for more answers. Instead, she'd overheard a truth so shocking, so earth-shattering, that for a moment she forgot how to breathe. In that instant, as the hospital continued its nightly routine around them, 4 lives hung in the balance. Margaret, crushed by the weight of her actions. Elizabeth, grappling with a truth that challenged everything she knew. Daniel, fighting a battle against his own biology. And Sarah, suddenly faced with a family history rewritten. As the night deepened, the stage was set for confrontations and revelations that would change them all forever. The truth, so long buried, had finally clawed its way to the surface, and in its wake, it left a tangled web of love, lies, and the unbreakable bonds of family, both chosen and biological. The clock ticked steadily onward, counting down to a dawn that promised either healing or heartbreak. For Margaret Thompson, the longest shift of her life was far from over. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor seemed to pulse in time with Margaret's racing heart as she hurried towards Daniel's room. The weight of Dr. Richardson's revelation pressed down on her, making each step feel like she was wading through quicksand. As she approached room 507, raised voices spilled out into the hallway. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the speakers, Elizabeth and Sarah, locked in a heated exchange. "You have no right to be here." Elizabeth's voice cracked with emotion. "He's my son." "I'm not trying to take him away from you," Sarah shot back, her tone a mix of frustration and pleading. "But don't you see? This affects me too. He's my brother." Margaret froze just outside the door, her hand hovering over the handle. The moment of truth had arrived, ready or not. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The scene before her was one of barely contained chaos. Elizabeth stood protectively by Daniel's bedside, her eyes red-rimmed but flashing with determination. Sarah paced the small room like a caged animal, while Daniel himself looked bewildered and pale against the stark white sheets. All eyes turned to Margaret as she entered. "Mom," Sarah began, her voice trembling. "Is it true? What I overheard in the chapel, is Daniel really?" Margaret nodded slowly, feeling the weight of 50 years of secrets finally lifting from her shoulders. "Yes, Sarah, Daniel is your biological brother." The room erupted into a cacophony of voices. "What?" Daniel exclaimed, attempting to sit up before wincing in pain. "How dare you keep this from us all these years?" Elizabeth cried, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, sinking into a nearby chair. Margaret raised her hands, pleading for calm. "Please, I know you all have questions. You deserve answers. But Daniel's health has to come first. Can we please focus on that for now?" As if on cue, Dr. Richardson entered the room, his face grave. "I'm glad you're all here. We need to make some decisions, and quickly. Daniel's condition is deteriorating faster than we anticipated." The doctor's words seemed to cut through the tension in the room, redirecting everyone's attention to the immediate crisis at hand. "What do you mean, deteriorating?" Elizabeth asked, her anger momentarily replaced by fear. Dr. Richardson sighed heavily. "The genetic condition we've identified is extremely rare and aggressive. The treatment we started earlier, it's not working as well as we'd hoped." Daniel's weak voice cut through the ensuing silence. Just tell me straight, Doc. How bad is it?" The doctor met Daniel's gaze steadily. "Without an immediate bone marrow transplant, your organs will begin to shut down within the next 24 to 48 hours. The news hit the room like a physical blow. Elizabeth let out a choked sob, while Sarah gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Margaret, however, felt a sudden, fierce clarity. "Test me," she said, her voice stronger than it had been all day. "Test me and Sarah. We might be a match." Dr. Richardson nodded briskly. "I've already ordered the tests. We should have results within the hour. But I have to warn you, even if we find a match, the procedure is risky. Given Daniel's weakened state," he didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication hung heavy in the air. Even with a transplant, Daniel's survival was far from guaranteed. As the doctor left to expedite the tests, an uneasy quiet settled over the room. The magnitude of the situation, both medical and emotional, seemed to press in from all sides. It was Daniel who finally broke the silence. "So," he said, his attempt at a light-hearted tone belied by the tremor in his voice, "I guess family reunions are going to be pretty awkward from now on, huh?" A startled laugh escaped Sarah's lips, more a release of tension than genuine mirth. Even Elizabeth's mouth twitched in a ghost of a smile. Margaret moved to Daniel's bedside, taking his hand in hers. For the first time, she allowed herself to really look at him, not as a patient, not as a reminder of her greatest mistake, but as the son she had never known. "Daniel," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "I know this is all overwhelming, and I know that no apology can ever make up for what I've done. But I want you to know that not a day has gone by in the last 50 years that I haven't thought about you, that I haven't wondered." She trailed off, overcome. Daniel squeezed her hand weakly. I don't know how to feel about all this," he admitted. "But I do know one thing. I'm scared, and right now I'm just glad I'm not alone." Elizabeth moved to Daniel's other side, her earlier anger seemingly forgotten in the face of her son's vulnerability. "You're not alone, sweetheart. You'll never be alone." As mother and son embraced, Sarah caught Margaret's eye across the bed. The hurt and confusion were still there, but something else had joined them, a fierce determination that Margaret recognized all too well. "So," Sarah said, rolling up her sleeve, "when do we start these tests? Because I don't know about you, but I'm not losing my brother the same day I found out I had one." The next hour passed in a blur of needle pricks, tense silences, and hushed conversations. Margaret found herself oscillating between hope and despair, her mind racing with all the possible outcomes. What if neither she nor Sarah was a match? What if the transplant didn't work? And even if Daniel survived, how could they possibly move forward from here? How does a family rebuild itself from the ashes of a 50-year-old lie? Just as the waiting threatened to drive them all mad, Dr. Richardson returned, his face unreadable. "We have the results," he announced, looking from face to face in the crowded hospital room. Margaret held her breath, acutely aware of Sarah's hand gripping her arm, of Elizabeth's soft murmurs to a now sleeping Daniel. This was it, the moment that would determine not just Daniel's fate, but the future of two families irrevocably intertwined by one nurse's long-ago mistake. Dr. Richardson took a deep breath. "There's a match." A collective gasp filled the room. Hope, fragile but undeniable, began to bloom. But before anyone could celebrate, the doctor held up a hand. "There's something else you need to know. Something the genetic tests revealed. Something that changes, well, everything." And with those words, Dr. Richardson unleashed a revelation that would shake the very foundations of everything Margaret thought she knew, about that night 50 years ago, about the lives she had altered, and about the true nature of family. The final act of Margaret Thompson's last shift was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same again. The revelation from Dr. Richardson left the room in stunned silence. Margaret, Sarah, Elizabeth, and a barely conscious Daniel tried to process the earth-shattering news. Daniel and Sarah were not just siblings, but identical twins. And there was a third sibling out there, unknown and unfound. "Triplets," Margaret whispered, the weight of her 50-year-old mistake crashing down on her with renewed force. "There were 3 babies that night. How could I have not realized?" As the initial shock wore off, the gravity of Daniel's condition brought them back to the present. Dr. Richardson explained that with 2 perfect genetic matches, Daniel's chances of survival had significantly improved. The bone marrow transplant was scheduled immediately, with both Margaret and Sarah insisting on being tested as potential donors. The following weeks were a whirlwind of medical procedures, tearful conversations, and cautious hope. Daniel's body accepted the transplant, and slowly but surely, he began to recover. Sarah barely left his side, the newly discovered twins forming a bond that seemed to transcend their years apart. Elizabeth, after her initial anger and disbelief, found herself warming to this expanded family. She and Margaret formed an unlikely alliance, united in their love for Daniel and their shared determination to right the wrongs of the past. As Daniel grew stronger, the question that had been lurking in everyone's minds finally rose to the surface. What about their third sibling? "We need to find him," Sarah said one evening, her voice filled with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "He deserves to know the truth. And what if he's sick too? What if he needs us like Daniel did?" Margaret nodded, a familiar guilt gnawing at her insides. "I'll do whatever it takes. I've kept this secret for far too long. It's time to make things right." With Daniel's blessing, they hired a private investigator. Weeks turned into months as they searched, each dead end more disheartening than the last. But they refused to give up. During this time, Margaret found herself reflecting on the nature of family and forgiveness. She watched in awe as Daniel and Sarah's relationship blossomed, marveling at how quickly they fell into a comfortable sibling dynamic despite their years apart. It was as if some part of them had always known, had always been searching for this missing piece. Elizabeth, too, underwent a transformation. Her initial fury at Margaret had given way to a complex mix of emotions. There were still moments of anger and grief for the years lost, but there was also a growing understanding. After all, Elizabeth had raised Daniel, had been there for every skinned knee and proud moment. Biology couldn't change that bond. One particularly difficult evening, after another lead had proven fruitless, Elizabeth found Margaret alone in the hospital cafeteria, staring blankly into a cold cup of coffee. "You know," Elizabeth said, sliding into the seat across from her, "I used to think I'd never forgive you if I ever met you." Margaret looked up, startled. "I wouldn't blame you if you didn't," she replied softly. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. But seeing Daniel and Sarah together, seeing how happy he is despite everything, I'm starting to realize that maybe this was always meant to be. That doesn't excuse what happened, but it gives it meaning, Margaret finished, tears welling in her eyes. Elizabeth nodded, reaching across the table to squeeze Margaret's hand. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. As the search for their missing brother continued, life began to find a new normal. Daniel was discharged from the hospital, though he still required frequent checkups. Sarah took a leave of absence from her job to help with his care, moving into Elizabeth's spare room. Margaret found herself spending more and more time with them, getting to know the children she had unknowingly brought into the world. There were difficult moments, of course, times when the weight of the past threatened to overwhelm them. Daniel struggled with reconciling his identity as Elizabeth's son with this new biological reality. Sarah grappled with feelings of guilt for having had a relationship with Margaret all these years while Daniel hadn't. And Margaret carried the burden of her secret, the knowledge that her one moment of confusion had altered so many lives. But there were beautiful moments too. The first time Daniel called Margaret Mom, tentative and shy, but full of promise. The night Sarah and Elizabeth stayed up until dawn, looking through old photo albums and sharing stories of Daniel's childhood. The Sunday afternoon when they all attempted to cook dinner together, resulting in a spectacularly burnt casserole and hours of laughter. Then, on a crisp autumn morning, as they were preparing for one of Daniel's checkups, Margaret's phone rang. The caller ID showed the investigator's number. "We found him," the voice on the other end said simply. "Your son. He's alive, and he's here in the city." Margaret's hand shook as she relayed the news to the others. A mix of emotions flooded the room: excitement, fear, anticipation. How would this long-lost brother react to the truth? Could a family fractured for 50 years ever truly be whole? As they prepared to meet the final piece of their extraordinary puzzle, Margaret looked around at the faces that had become so dear to her. Daniel, still pale but gaining strength every day. Sarah, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Elizabeth, squeezing Daniel's hand supportively. In that moment, Margaret realized that family was not defined by blood alone, but by love, by choice, and sometimes by the twists of fate that bring us together against all odds. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be more tears, more difficult conversations, more adjustments as they all learned to navigate this new reality. Margaret watched Daniel and Sarah, heads bent together as they speculated about their unknown brother. She felt a glimmer of hope. Her last shift as a nurse had ended weeks ago, but Margaret Thompson's journey was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. And for the first time in 50 years, she faced the future not with dread, but with cautious optimism. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave the hospital, the place where their lives had changed so dramatically, Margaret took a deep breath. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. A family forged in the fires of truth, united by an unbreakable bond. The story of the switched triplets was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. As they stepped out into the crisp autumn air, the future stretched before them, full of possibilities and unanswered questions. What would their long-lost brother be like? Would he welcome them with open arms or reject them outright? How would they all adapt to this new family dynamic? And what other secrets might still be lurking in the shadows of the past? These questions and more swirled in Margaret's mind as they made their way to the car. But for now, she pushed them aside, focusing instead on the warmth of Sarah's hand in hers, the sound of Daniel's laughter as he joked with Elizabeth. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And now, dear listener, as we come to the end of this chapter in Margaret's story, I have a question for you. Has this tale of family, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us moved you? Has it made you think about the secrets we keep and the truths we tell? If so, I urge you to take action. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Perhaps a friend grappling with family issues of their own, or a loved one struggling to forgive past mistakes. By sharing, you're not just passing on a story, you're spreading a message of hope and redemption. And if you want to be the first to know what happens next in Margaret's journey, if you're curious about the meeting with the long-lost brother and the challenges that lie ahead, then do this one simple thing. Subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you're not just signing up for more stories. You're joining a community of people who believe in the power of narrative to change lives. You're saying yes to more tales that will make you laugh, cry, and see the world in a new light. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Share this video with a friend. Be part of something bigger than yourself. Because who knows, the next twist in the tale might be just around the corner, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Remember, every family has a story, but some stories have the power to change us forever. This is one of them. Don't let it end here. Subscribe now, and let's continue this journey together.